The morning came to Michelle like a photograph developing in reverse. Clear details dissolving into fog, sharp edges bleeding into soft uncertainty. She woke in her bedroom, sunlight streaming through curtains that seemed both familiar and strange, as if she were seeing them for the first time while simultaneously remembering them from 1,000 mornings. Her alarm clock read 7:23 a.m., the red digits glowing with a persistence that felt almost aggressive. Tuesday, October 3rd. But hadn't it been Tuesday yesterday? The thought arrived and departed like a bird passing a window, there and gone before she could examine it properly. She showered, the water temperature fluctuating between scalding and ice cold, though her hands never touched the faucet. Or had she already showered? Her hair felt wet, then dry, then wet again, the sensations layering over each other like translucent images in a flipbook. Time, she realized with a flutter of unease that tasted like copper on her tongue, had become slippery. Marcus was in the kitchen, coffee in hand, wearing his blue shirt, the blue shirt he'd worn yesterday, or last week. Michelle couldn't tell anymore, couldn't separate this morning from all the other mornings that seemed to be happening simultaneously in her head. "Happy anniversary," he said, kissing her cheek. Anniversary. The word hung in the air like smoke, curling and dissipating before she could grab hold of its meaning. Anniversary of what? Their wedding had been... when? 5 years ago? Or 15? Or tomorrow? The numbers scattered like marbles across a tilted floor, rolling away from her grasping comprehension. "How long?" she asked, her voice sounding distant, as if someone else were speaking with her mouth. 17 years today, Marcus said, but his smile flickered like a bulb with loose wiring. Or was he frowning? Michelle couldn't discern which expression was actually on his face. They seemed to occupy the same space, superimposed like double-exposed film. She looked at her hands. They were smooth and unlined, the hands of her 30-year-old self. But when she blinked, they were weathered, spotted with age, the hands of someone who'd lived decades more. Blink again, young, blink old. The versions of her hands existed simultaneously, as she'd lost the ability to tell which was real, which was now. The kitchen tilted, or maybe it had always been tilted and she was only noticing. Marcus spoke, but his words arrived scrambled, out of order. "Remember when we go into the doctor, said you were not to worry? Had they gone to a doctor? Were they going? Would they go?" Michelle's reflection in the kitchen window showed her at 8 years old, braids in her hair, sitting at her mother's table. But she was also standing here, 47 or 30 or 63, watching herself as a child. The past pressed against the present like a hand against wet clay, leaving impressions, smearing boundaries. "I can't tell," she whispered, and the admission opened something inside her, a dam breaking. "I can't tell when I am." Her wedding day bloomed in her mind with vivid clarity. Marcus in his tux, her father crying, the taste of champagne. But it was happening now. She was living it now. Even as she stood in this kitchen holding coffee that was simultaneously hot and cold and not there at all. She was at her mother's funeral, the casket open, the flowers overwhelming. But her mother was also calling from the living room, asking about dinner, alive and dead at the same moment, both realities equally true, equally false. The memories weren't memories anymore. They were all present tense, all happening at once. A symphony played with every note struck simultaneously until it became just noise, just chaos, and there, threading through the jumbled chronology of her existence, she saw it. The hospital room. The machines beeping their monotonous rhythm. Marcus holding her hand, older now, his face carved with grief. A doctor speaking softly, saying things about time, about the end, about making her comfortable. Was that yesterday? Tomorrow? Now? Michelle felt herself fracturing across the timeline of her life, unable to discern which moment was the real one, which version of herself was actually her. She was 8 and 18 and 80, alive and dying and dead, all distinctions collapsing into a singular, eternal present that contained everything and meant nothing. Michelle? Marcus's voice, young and old, worried and calm. Michelle, can you hear me? She tried to answer, but couldn't tell if the words left her mouth, or had been spoken years ago, or would be spoken in moments yet to come. Time had become a book with all its pages pressed together, and she was trapped between them, unable to discern which page was hers, which story was her life. In the hospital room, that was also her kitchen, that was also her childhood home, Michelle closed her eyes across every moment of her existence, unable to tell if she was beginning or ending, unable to tell if there was any difference at all. The Chateau Margaux 1787 arrived in a velvet-lined case that whispered of old money and older secrets. Elena Vasquez had tasted wines that cost more than cars, had rolled vintages on her tongue that predated the Civil War, but something about this bottle made her hands tremble as she worked the cork free. The auction house had called it a find of historical significance. Thomas Jefferson's own cellar, they claimed. A wine that had waited 2 centuries in darkness to meet the light. She didn't need to smell it. Didn't need to examine the color against candlelight or check the legs sliding down crystal. The moment the first drop touched her tongue, knowledge flooded through her like a dark river finding the sea. This was her power, the one firstborn granddaughters of a witch would get. It is a limited power that serves like a sampling to tempt full surrender to the coven. But Elena used it to turn herself into the most sought-after sommelier in 3 states. She could taste a wine and know things. The vintage, obviously, but also the weather that year, whether it had been a drought summer or if September rains had fattened the grapes. She could discern the winemaker's mood, their technique, even the mineral composition of the soil. Her reviews read like poetry. Her recommendations were gospel. But the Margaux told her something wine shouldn't know. She tasted murder. Not metaphorically. Not the aggressive tannins or notes of violence that wine critics threw around like confetti. Actual murder. She tasted hands around a throat. Tasted screaming that turned to gurgling. Tasted the moment life became death. And beneath it, threaded through the wine like copper wire through silk, she tasted blood. Human blood mixed with the vintage before bottling. Elena spat the wine into the sink, her stomach heaving. But the knowledge remained, branded into her consciousness with the permanence of scar tissue. She tried to forget, poured the bottle down the drain, and told the auction house it had turned to vinegar. For 3 days, she avoided wine entirely, subsisting on tap water and black coffee, trying to convince herself it had been stress, imagination, a neurological hiccup. Then she touched a glass of water. The sensations hit her like a freight train wrapped in velvet and thorns. The water spoke in voices that predated language, spoke of every mouth that had drunk from the reservoir, every pipe it had traveled through, every tear and drop of sweat and dribble of blood that had joined the endless hydrological cycle. She experienced drownings, dozens of them. Hundreds. The water remembered every person who had died, gasping it into their lungs. And now it shared those deaths with her in exquisite, undeniable detail. A child in a bathtub in 1952, a woman in a flooding basement in 2003, a man who'd chosen the river over the pain of living. Elena dropped the glass. It shattered into a constellation of glittering fragments, each one reflecting her horror back at her in fractured multiplication. The rain started that evening, a November storm that turned the sky to bruised pewter and hammered against her apartment windows like fists seeking entrance. She could hear it whispering. Each drop carried secrets. Each drop remembered. She lasted until 2 a.m. before thirst drove her to the kitchen. Her mouth felt lined with sand and ash and the ghost of that terrible wine. The faucet gleamed in the darkness like a chrome accusation. One sip, she told herself. One small sip. The water tasted of 1,000 lakes and rivers and aquifers, tasted of oceans that had birthed life and swallowed civilizations. It tasted every tear shed in the city, every desperate prayer whispered over a dying bedside, every christening and drowning and storm. The water was a library of liquid memory and her gift. Her terrible, evolved gift. Read every page simultaneously. She saw them then in the patterns the water made swirling down the drain. The dead, not ghosts exactly, but impressions. Echoes preserved in the medium that covered 70% of the earth. The water remembered them all, and now so did she. Elena sank to the kitchen floor, her body racked with knowledge no human nervous system was designed to contain. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming its ancient rhythm against glass and pavement and skin. It had always been speaking. Water had always carried these stories, these deaths, these secrets. She'd just never been cursed enough to understand the language. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus at the restaurant. Big tasting tomorrow. 1947 Cheval Blanc. You in? Elena looked at her trembling hands, at the water still dripping from the faucet, at the rain streaming down her windows like the tears of a weeping world. She thought about wine, about all wine, fermented from grapes that had drunk deeply from soil enriched by centuries of death and decay, about juice pressed from fruit that had absorbed groundwater, that groundwater flowing through earth where bodies had returned to dust. Everything liquid carried memory now. Everything wet held secrets. And she would taste them all, whether she wanted to or not. The rain continued its patient testimony against the glass. Elena closed her eyes and began to cry, adding her own small grief to the water's infinite collection. The gift came to me on a Tuesday, sliding into my soul like a key finding its lock. One moment I was listening to Mrs. Hendricks confess her adultery, the usual mixture of guilt and self-justification that colors most human contrition. And the next, I knew. Not thought, not suspected, knew. She was genuinely sorry. The knowledge arrived complete and crystalline, undeniable as my own heartbeat. Within a month, my confessional booth had become something of a legend. Word spread through the parish like water finding cracks. Father Graham can tell if you really mean it. The Archbishop called it a profound pastoral sensitivity. I called it what it was. Discernment, that rarest of spiritual gifts. The ability to distinguish true repentance from performance, authentic contrition from the hollow theater of regret. I should have been grateful. I should have been humbled. Instead, on a rain-sick October evening that tasted of copper and old leaves, I met Thomas Carmichael, and everything I thought I understood about grace and souls and the architecture of redemption crumbled like sand castles before a black tide. He entered the booth at 7:47 p.m. I remember because I'd been checking my watch, eager to lock up and escape the church's oppressive silence. The wooden partition separated us. That thin membrane between confessor and penitent, between judgment and mercy. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," he began. His voice was ordinary, pleasant even. A middle-aged man's voice, roughened slightly by cigarettes or seasonal allergies. But when I extended my gift toward him, that spiritual sense that had become as natural as breathing, I felt nothing, not evil, not good. Not conflicted or guilty or defiant, just nothing, nothingness. It was like pressing your hand against a wall where a doorway should be, like calling into a cave and hearing no echo return. Thomas Carmichael sat 3 feet away from me, speaking words, taking up space, breathing the same stale air, and yet to my discernment, he simply wasn't there. A shadow without an object to cast it, a reflection with no mirror. "I've been angry with my wife," he continued, cataloging minor domestic grievances. "I've been impatient with my children. I've taken the Lord's name in vain." Standard confessional fare. Unremarkable sins that usually glowed with varying shades of authenticity under my gifts examination, but from Thomas Carmichael. Nothing. An absence shaped like a man. My mouth went dry. Mr. Carmichael, I interrupted. Have you ever been seriously ill? Had surgery, perhaps? An accident? A pause. Then he revealed. I died, Father, 2 years ago. Massive coronary. They brought me back after 4 minutes. 4 minutes. 240 seconds of clinical death. And then the miracle of modern medicine, the shock of defibrillator paddles, the gasping return to life. Except something hadn't returned, or something else had. I started paying attention after that, cataloging the empty ones among my penitents. Marian Torres, drowned and resuscitated at 14. David Park, car accident, revived by paramedics after 3 minutes flatlined. Sarah Cheyenne, overdose, narking back from the edge. All of them spoke. All of them performed the rituals of confession with perfect adequacy. All of them were hollow to my gift, like beautifully painted doors that opened onto nothing. And then I began noticing the others. The ones who had also died and returned, but who blazed with presence. Too much presence, like overfilled vessels threatening to crack their containers. Their confessions rang with emotions too vivid, hungers too sharp, guilts too exquisitely rendered to be entirely human. Something doesn't always come back, I realized, sitting alone in my confessional on a Thursday night, listening to rain drum against stained glass like fingers seeking entrance. And something else occasionally does. The Archbishop called my growing reluctance to hear confessions burn out. He suggested a sabbatical, perhaps therapy. How could I explain? How could I tell him that every Sunday I distribute communion to a congregation where some souls have gone missing and some have been replaced? Where the empty ones and the overfilled ones kneel side by side, indistinguishable to everyone but me? The gift of discernment, the ability to perceive what others cannot. God help me, I wish I'd remained blind. Tonight, Thomas Carmichael returned. He stood outside my confessional booth for a long moment, and I could hear him breathing, or whatever the hollow ones do that sounds like breathing. Father Graham, he said through the partition, I think we should talk about what you can see, about what we are. The door is locked. The rain continues its patient percussion, and I'm learning that some truths, once discerned, cannot be unknown.